Little by little, this American story of ours is beginning to take shape. Before we add a bit, however, let's go back and see where we are. In early 1493, when Ferdinand and Isabella learned that Columbus had returned, even before he got to the court to report, they had a fast messenger on the way to Rome. The Spanish ambassador there was instructed to register the Spanish claims and to seek the pontiff's approval. This was standard practice in those days, in the 15th century. Portugal, for example, in the years when she had been inching down the African coast, had been careful to register the claims and ask the Pope's approval. Europe in general recognized this as the way to do business. Now, later in that year, 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued several bulls and drew his famous line of demarcation. When the Spaniards and the Portuguese sat down and looked it over, they were a little bit hesitant. They began to ask themselves, do we want it exactly here? So early in the next year, 1494, they gathered together in the little border town of Tordesillas. It's spelled just like it sounds. And there they rectified the line somewhat. They pushed it 370 leagues westward of the Cape Verde Islands. And this, arrangement gave the Portuguese the bulge of Brazil, gave them a claim to the bulge of Brazil. Now, after they had done this, since they figured, okay, we've been there first, the Pope has okayed our claims, let's sit back and begin to take advantage of it. Now, that was rather easy for several decades. One of the reasons for it was that the other Europeans were either too uninterested in what they had learned about the New World, what the reports were, or, which was much more likely, they were much too preoccupied with their own affairs. Now, the word that came back from the West about the lands there was not particularly tempting. And I think that we ought to recognize that even Spain herself for a long time was rather disappointed. So therefore, while the Tudors in England began to lay the foundations upon which the future English greatness would be built, while the Germanys were still disorganized and disunited and very soon would be even more divided when religious difficulties grew up early in the 16th century, the Italies at the time lacked unified leadership. France, for quite a number of years, was meddling in Italy, and then subsequently was fighting hard to prevent what she feared was encirclement by the Habsburgs, by Charles V, one of the great monarchs of the day, one of the great landowners of the day. He was Lord of Austria. He was Emperor of the Germanies. He had lands in the Netherlands. He was King of Spain. He had other lands scattered through Italy. The result was that while the Europeans were busy, Spain had pretty much an open field. Now, as we saw in our last, Spain ultimately hit the jackpot. She hit the jackpot first in Mexico, then in Peru. And very naturally, the Spaniards said, let's keep it quiet. Let's not let the word of our good fortune get out. And she might have gotten away with it, but for a rather curious quirk of fate. Now, remember that 1520, roughly, let's put that as the date for the jackpot, the first of her jackpots. For about 20 years prior to that, the Portuguese had been building in the East. They'd been building their trading empire. And little by little, around the tip of Africa, working on up toward Lisbon, the Portuguese caravels, year after year, had been carrying very rich cargoes. Now, one thing that happened almost immediately was that other Europeans individuals more than nations got wind of this, and privateers, freebooters, pirates began to lurk off the coast of Africa between the Azores and Lisbon, and the occasional Portuguese vessel was captured, its cargo was taken. This was rich booty. Now, during the same time, you also had traffic from the Indies of the West. And occasionally, the freebooters, the pirates, would take a Spanish galleon. But after a little time, they figured it's hardly worthwhile. The Spaniards were bringing back a certain number of hides, pretty stinking. They were bringing back a certain amount of sugar, a little bit of gold, and a little bit of silver. The pirates said it's hardly worth our while to knock ourselves out to take these Spanish galleons. Now, in 1523, about 2 years after Cortez had completed the conquest of Mexico, he decided what he better do is gather up a certain amount of the treasure and send it back to Charles V. And a fleet left Veracruz, heading back across the ocean. Now, just by chance, certain pirates were cruising off the Azores. And a certain Jean Fleury, or Jean Le Florentin, very probably it was our friend Giovanni Verrazzano. We're not too sure of that, but at any rate, he caught 2 of these galleons. They were more or less doing it kind of as a practice run. And from their previous experience, the Frenchmen went down into the holds, more probably holding their noses, figuring a bunch of stinking hides. Let's hope that there's a little bit of sugar. Maybe they've been lucky. Let's hope that they've hit just a little bit of gold and silver. They got down there and opened up these chests, and, well, we can't even say in French what they said at that time in their surprise and in their amazement. Here it was. The Spaniards hit the jackpot. Now, it was the job of the Frenchmen to keep a secret. But those kind of secrets don't keep. Before very long, the word got out that the Spaniards had hit luck. And soon, the seas around the Azores, well, you practically needed a traffic cop to keep the pirates in line. They were all waiting to catch a Spanish galleon, or 2 or 3, or as many as they could. Now, during this period, France and Spain were practically continually at war. And the French monarch, Francis Valois, decided, all right, here's a good way to get back at the Spaniards. And so Francis commissioned a certain number of French privateers to prey upon Spanish homebound traffic. Little by little, the Frenchmen became more interested and more audacious, and they pushed across. Instead of being in the Azores, they began to lurk in American waters. Their next great stroke of fate was, or stroke of luck, came in 1537. By this time, raiding Spanish commerce had become pretty much a business enterprise, and there was at Dieppe a group of merchants, the Ongo brothers, and in this year 37, they were cruising around outside the Caribbean area here, and they were lucky enough to catch the treasure fleet from Peru. The conquest of Peru was more or less completed by this time, and the Spanish officials, Pizarro and his men, were sending a certain share of the plunder back to Charles. Now, on this particular occasion, they cut out several galleons. We don't know how much they got, but we do know from Spanish records that what came into Spain, of that, the king's share, Charles V's share, was $10 million. Now, that's not peanuts. So, word got around, and they figured, why wait? Why take a chance way over in the Atlantic? Let's begin to move into this Spanish Sea. around the islands of the Caribbean and the northern region of South America, the area known as the Spanish Main. The, pardon, the Spaniards hit back. For example, they soon developed a convoy system for their fleets over to the New World, and very particularly for the homebound fleet back to Seville, which was carrying the treasure, carrying millions and millions of dollars of gold and silver. They developed a coast guard, the Armada de Barlovento, which tried to patrol these islands and to cut down the possibility of pirates lurking in certain of the small keys and the like. Then they moved up ultimately and set a settlement here on the Florida coast at St. Augustine, 65. Why did they go up here? Remember that coming back from the New World, the treasure would come up from Peru. It would be brought over here to Panama, across the isthmus. The Mexican treasure would be brought down to Veracruz. Then the two fleets would meet and rendezvous at Havana here. And then, under convoy, would work their way up through the Florida Strait until they got off the Carolina coast. There they hit the trade winds, which blew them across the ocean and landed them in the Azores. The Azores to Seville was an easy jump. So therefore, it was quite important that they hold this. Spain was reacting, and while the French, for some years more, continued to bedevil them, to attack their islands, to attack their shipping, and the like, after a time, there came a period of surcease, a period of peace. In 1559, the Habsburgs and the Valois, for the moment, composed their feud. This, however, only opened the door to another type of challenge to Spain's monopolistic claims. This period, the period of the 60s, brings into focus the English. Now, by this time, the English are developing their mercantile interest, and they are meeting with a good deal of success. There's a good deal of capital that has been built up, and the merchant adventurers are looking around anxiously for new markets, new sources of goods which they can market, which they can peddle in Europe. And as they do, the Spanish Indies seems to offer an excellent market, potential market. They know very well that Spain is not much of an industrial country. The Spaniards are not going to be able to supply the needs of their American colonials, so they would like to muscle in. Now, Spain, during this period, has set up a monopoly. She's put up keep out signs all around, particularly keep out you foreigners. And after the religious differences occur in Europe, underneath that, she puts keep out you foreign heretics. She doesn't want any foreigners messing in her new world. Now, there's a group, however, of Englishmen that figure it's worth a trial. And this leads to the advent, or to the entry on the New World scene, of a rather interesting character, John Hawkins, because he becomes the agent of a group of merchants. Now, their idea is, let's do a little discreet smuggling and prove to Philip that it would be worthwhile for competition. In other words, his colonials would be better off. Even his Spanish merchants would be better off, to whom he has given a monopoly, if we can only have some competition. Now, they can't go to Philip II directly. Philip is a very hard, a very stern character. They can't go to him and say, how about this, Phil? No. They knew just what part of the anatomy they would get thrown out on. Now, however, they do this. Hawkins gathers together a couple ships. He gets some merchandise and heads first for the African coast. There he deals with the Portuguese slave traders and picks up a certain number of Negroes. He knows that the Negroes are at a premium in the plantations, which are quite well established through the Caribbean now. In practically all of the Caribbean islands which Spain has acquired, she is growing sugar. So he comes over and lands on the northern coast of Hispaniola. He asks for permission to anchor and refit. He knows he has no business there. The Spanish officials also know that no foreigners to come in. But he comes in and asks in the name of sweet charity and so on, and they say, okay, these people are Christians, let's give them an opportunity. Let's not turn them away. Now, while he's there, Hawkins slips the idea around. What are you boys paying for Negro slaves these days? Wouldn't be interested in getting a few at about half price, would you? Oh, senor, no, we cannot deal with you people. Half price. Well, you know what happens. The price is good. They buy his slaves. They buy a certain amount of the merchandise. And more than that, they leave orders. He goes on back to England. His first trip has been successful. So he goes back to report to his backers and to get ready to fill some of these orders. He makes upwards of 300% profit, which is pretty good in any league. A few years later, he comes out and he's going to check a new potential market. See, he's been through the islands. He's pretty certain, pretty secure about that. So he's going to come along the Spanish Main. Now, in the meantime, news has gotten back to Spain that an Englishman has been in American waters and that the Spaniards have traded with him. Philip II has sent out stern directives, no truck, no traffic with these Englishmen. So he meets a certain amount of sales resistance, but his prices are right. And he more or less lets the Spaniard make up his own mind. However, the Spaniard says to him, Senor, look, we will get in trouble with our king. You have to help us. So he said, how can I help you? And they said, suppose you threaten to blow us from here to kingdom come if we don't trade with you. Then we can tell the king we chose the lesser of two evils. There was no particular reason for destruction. This Englishman, a furious fellow, he said, unless you take this merchandise and take it at these prices, why, I'll put you to death and so on and so forth. Senor King, that's all we could do. Philip isn't very much impressed. So when Hawkins comes out on his next trip in 68, 69, this time he does meet sales resistance. Trading is slow. He tries the islands, he tries down here, and then somewhat dejectedly, because the Spaniards' backs have been stiffened now by the decrees of Philip, he figures, okay, we've made a nice try, let's go on back. So he starts back across the Caribbean and cuts through the Yucatan Strait, is going to skirt up through Florida, through the Florida Strait, and it's autumn. Now, you know what happens in autumn in the Caribbean. It's the hurricane season. Now, whether it was Dolores or Estrellita or Flora, I don't know who caught him here. But he was blown back and had to run before the storm and landed in the port of Veracruz. He was in really bad shape at this time. And it was quite problematic as to whether or not his ships could get back. So he asks for permission to stop in the roadstead at Veracruz and to try to repair his shipping. The Spaniards warn him. They say, we really shouldn't let you do this. But if you want to take the chance, we'll not shoot. However, move fast, son, because a new viceroy for New Spain is on the way and he's apt to come in any day. Well, actually what happened was Martin Enriquez got to Veracruz before Hawkins could refit and get out. And Enriquez had these orders from Philip, and what he does is turn the shore batteries on the Spaniards, and they have to get away as best they can. Now, with Hawkins on this voyage was the young man whose name is going to dominate the next period, and that is Sir Francis Drake. He wasn't Sir Francis at this time. He hadn't done enough harm to the Spaniards to have been knighted. He was just old Frankie Drake. Now, the Drake goes back, and he vows that he will spend the rest of his life doing as much harm as he can to these treacherous, perfidious Spaniards. He probably added a few other adjectives, too. All right, on his own, a few years later, he comes out to the Isthmus. Now, here he performs a very daring deed. We mentioned before that the treasure from Peru and Bolivia comes up here, is landed at Panama, then crosses the Isthmus by mule pack, and is put in the treasure house here. At that time, it was Nombre de Dios. Cute little story, but we'd almost have to get ourselves in trouble with the FCC in telling you the story about how this place was named. All right, he figures here, why wait until the Spaniards get out on the high seas, or even get out on the Caribbean? Let's take it right there while it's waiting to be loaded. And so he comes onto the Isthmus and surprises and captures Nombre de Dios. But he's surprised in his turn. He had moved about 6 weeks too soon. There was a little bit of treasure that had been stored up, but the real treasure, the annual yield, had not yet come. And he had tipped his hand. From this point on, the Spaniards were going to be on the lookout for him. So therefore, he was somewhat disappointed, but he decided, we'll still do it. We'll still outmaneuver them. So he played along the Isthmus and the Spanish Main for a couple more months, then came back onto the Isthmus, and at the strategic time, instead of trying to recapture the treasure house at Nombre de Dios, he pulls on inland and intercepts the train as it's going, as it's heading toward the Caribbean port. Now, according to reports, the English took as much as they could carry and buried 15 ton of silver bullion. Nobody has ever been able to find that. I don't know what they'd do with it if they did find it today. But at any rate, here is something. He really gets at the Spaniards in their own territory. Now, a great number of Englishmen are going to try to follow his example. And the Caribbean, in the next years, it almost burgeons with Englishmen trying to, striking at the Isthmus, striking at the islands, and so on. Spain is much bedeviled. At the end of the decade of the 70s, Drake is going to carry the war against Spain into a new theater. Up to this time, the Pacific had been considered by the Spaniards as their own operation. Now, he decides to come on down and attack them in the Pacific. He takes them completely by surprise. And other people follow him. Now, at about that same time, or very shortly thereafter, Philip, who is becoming more and more vexed and incensed at the actions and the antics of the English, finally decide that the English and the Dutch, who by this time have revolted against him, that they must be taught a salutary lesson. And so, in the late 80s, in 1588, he gathers together this tremendous battle fleet, the Spanish Armada, and sends it against the English and the Dutch. Now, as we know, a combination of a fortuitous storm and the bravery of the English, aided by the Dutch, turns the Armada back. Now, this is, I'm not trying to pun, but this really is a turning point, not only in European history, but it's a turning point in American history. Because now, Spain has lost her control of the seas, and From here out, it's going to be possible for anybody who is interested to move into the Americas to set up a rival empire, and that is what they do very quickly, as we'll see in our next. Now, to carry on the practice of suggesting one or two books here, there are two very excellent books on this period from the American side. The first of these is The European Nations in the West Indies by a great English colonial English historian, or English colonial historian, Arthur P. Newton. Percival is what the P stands for. An American has done an excellent job. Philip Ainsworth means the Spanish Main. Now, there must be a title page to this. There is. The Spanish Main, Focus of Envy, Philip Ainsworth Means. The English have done a good deal of work on this particular period, and one of the men who has written two rather excellent biographies is James A. Williamson. Here I have his Sir John Hawkins. He also has The Age of Drake. Both of them are quite interesting. Now, I wanted to get a little book in an American series, extremely readable and quite fascinating. William Wood's, it's William Wood, I'm sorry, The Elizabethan Sea Dogs. But, well, it's kind of a consoling thing. I went to the library the other afternoon looking for the 3 copies that we have there, and I hope that my students have them out. If they do, then you just take it. Wood, The Elizabethan Sea Dogs, will follow up much of what we have said in this present discussion. Now, also along these lines, there are several accounts of the pirates themselves, John Escameling, and so on, but we haven't time to go further. So therefore, Spain has been challenged, and Spain has been hurt, and the other nations are now going to be able, if they wish, and we'll see that they wish, to move in and found rival empires in the Americas. So, until next week, that's it.